This week on Quadriga, refugee crisis, new walls for Europe. Cold and wet conditions can't hold them back. Thousands of migrants are heading to Europe, fleeing war, persecution, and poverty. But Europe is beginning to close its borders. The situation for the men, women, and children stranded in the Balkans is catastrophic. At a crisis meeting in Brussels, 13 EU states agreed on measures to bring order to the chaos. Patrols are to be stepped up along the EU's borders, refugees will be registered in the country of their arrival, and deportation procedures will be accelerated. That raises the question, will Europe build new walls to keep the refugees out? Coming to you from Berlin, Quadriga, the international debate. Your host today, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Will the latest plan to manage the refugee crisis work? And if it does, will it hollow out some of Europe's core principles when it comes to asylum? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga with three people who've been following the refugee story very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Judy Dempsey. She's been a columnist for the International Herald Tribune and works now as a senior associate at Carnegie Europe and editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe. She says the walls are already being built, both physical and mental ones. Alan Posner is with us again. We're pleased to have you back. He's German-British author and commentator for the daily newspaper Die Welt. And he says if we want to keep the free movement of people within Europe, we have to keep those we don't want out of Europe. That means either new walls around Europe or new walls within it. And it's a pleasure to welcome Janusz Delcker. He's a political correspondent for Politico Europe, based here in Berlin. He says building walls won't help. Europe needs to become better in addressing the reasons that make refugees leave their home countries in the first place. So, Judy Dempsey, a new plan joins the pile of all those other plans with which Europe has hoped to manage this crisis. Let's remember one of the other recent ones. It was the one that looked to distribute 120,000 refugees fairly among EU member countries. Exactly 900 of those have already been transferred so far. So, bearing that in mind, what are the chances that this latest plan will actually be implemented in time to make a difference?
It won't be implemented, and it can't be implemented. And it can't be implemented because it involves the Western Balkan countries, Europe's back garden. And the European Union and the member states have actually messed up the Western Balkans. The Dayton Accords, which were signed nearly 20 years ago, they are practically not being implemented in Bosnia. There's enormous mismanagement and corruption in Kosovo. Albania is functioning, but the rule of law is very weak. We have problems with Macedonia in the relations with Greece. We have Montenegro, who's struggling to get into NATO, but it has its own problems. But essentially, the rule of law, governance and state building is just too weak to deal with the refugees, and these countries are too poor, despite the billions of EU money sent in there.
But of course, on Sunday, other EU member countries did say, we'll give you money to make this work. We're going to set up containment centres, registration centres, so that you don't wave the refugees on through. So the financial support, theoretically, would be there.
This is a spectacular, common EU solution to a problem. Throw money at it. And as Janusz earlier said, it's the origins of the problem which actually have to be tackled. And interestingly, Chancellor Merkel knew that the agreement reached last Sunday was flawed. And she said it didn't go halfway towards what they really wanted. And we know what Germany really needs, peace in Syria, frankly.
And if I may add to that, I think, the EU is much less willing to throw money at the root causes of migration than it is at throwing at these, concrete measures they're trying to implement now on the Balkans.
I want to come back to root causes a bit later on in the program, but let's take a closer look at this plan. Even if it were implemented, Janusz Delcker, how much difference would it actually make? Chancellor Merkel did indeed say this is at best a first step.
Well, if you ask me, I don't think it would make any difference, because those people are on their way. And that's, it's one thing to propose erecting walls. And the other thing is the question how effective walls really are, if they work.
But this plan doesn't really propose erecting walls. It proposes creating registration centres. Those are not walls.
That's true, that's true. OK, so let's take one step back. what was agreed upon on Sunday was that the countries want to, work with each other better than they did before. This will only work if there's like some sort of coordination. And we've seen that this doesn't work. So what we're seeing now is Slovenia mentioning that they're going to build a wall to Croatia. We've had these talks. It's sort of like, it went back and forth with Austria building a wall. So it's kind of like it's sort of like shifting to that debate now.
Now, Alan Posner, even if they were to set up these registration centres with the supposed money that would be flowing from countries like Germany, how much good could that possibly do in terms of reducing the numbers of those who do eventually get asylum, given the huge size of the tide that we've been seeing?
I don't think these registration centres are intended to reduce the tide of refugees or migrants coming.
Aren't they intended to filter the stream, to sort out those who don't have a legitimate claim to...
No, we saw in the film clip, these people are registered with a fingerprint, with an electronic fingerprint, and all the police forces and frontier agencies of Europe are equipped with the software which can recognise this. So if the person who's been registered and says in, say, Croatia, then comes to Bavaria and says, I've just arrived from Syria, they take the fingerprint and they can show, no, wait a minute, we know where you've been. So at least they know who's been where, claiming what kind of benefits and so on. This is just managing the problem. It's not reducing the number, but it's important to manage the problem because the fact is we don't know who's where. We don't know who's claiming benefits where. We don't know who came from where. There may be, 100,000 people in Germany who are illegally here because we've never had a chance even to register, if you look at some of the scenes in front of our registration places. So, OK, this is a small measure, but it's one that has to be done. I'm glad that it's being... We'll see if it works. But if it works, fine. I mean, that's a small step in the right direction.
But as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the refugees who are taken into these registration centres are not then sent merrily on their way to wherever they want to go. The idea is that they would, first of all, have to apply for asylum, and once they receive asylum, they would then be distributed officially, not necessarily to their first country of choice. Now, that will not be attractive to a number of refugees. What is the likelihood that it will really slow the tide of those who take it upon themselves to cross rivers, to climb fences, and in some way or other to get to the countries that they see as generous places, namely Germany and Sweden?
We'll have to wait and see, won't we? Because I think there's all this talk about generation smartphone. People saw Merkel saying, you're welcome, so they set out from Baghdad. Well, if that's true, they're also seeing what's happening here. They're also seeing people in the winter in the Balkans. They're also seeing the queues in front of the registration centres in Berlin. They're also seeing horrible things like asylum centres being burnt down and so on. There cannot be any feeling in Baghdad or in Damascus or in Aleppo that they're going to be welcome in Germany. So there may come a realisation to these people that, I might be better off in Belgrade, in spite of everything, than in Berlin. I might be better off, goodness knows where. I might be better off in Turkey. I'm not in favour of sending bad messages, but these people, they can read, they can see, they can use the internet. They're seeing that they're not welcome here in Germany, and they will have to react.
Are they really not welcome here in Germany? There's a new survey just out by a French demoscopic organisation, Judy Dempsey, that shows that 3/4 of Germans, the most in Europe, are still saying, look, we are happy to take in those who have legitimate claims to having been politically persecuted or fleeing war, people with real claims to asylum.
Yeah, it is actually quite remarkable how the public opinion has been maintained. Just let's look at this public opinion. You have various parallel sections of the society. The political elites, they're quite divided over this. And Chancellor Angela Merkel's conservative bloc is wavering. They're getting a bit worried. Of course, they're looking at the opinion polls. OK, there are state elections coming up. And then you have the older people, especially in Eastern Germany. But to be fair, older people in Western Germany, in the western parts of Germany, they feel uncomfortable with this. I mean, talking about the older generation, that the comfort zone has been seriously punctured. And then you have this younger generation who have discovered civil society, a real awakening, a real determination to be flexible, to be spontaneous, to actually break through the bureaucracy and help people. They've had enough of this. They have seen this war. They've seen enough on the television, on the social media, what is happening in Iraq and Syria, and they said it's now time to help. And this is remarkable. This is Merkel's big strength at the moment.
And indeed, Janusz Delka, many people are saying that if the Germans remain so positive on immigration, that undoubtedly is the Merkel effect. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think she had an impact on that, of course. I mean, she famously said, we will manage, wir schaffen das.
She's still saying it.
She's still saying that, even though she's sort of like, you know, adding like sub-clauses afterwards now. So I think she has a certain, there's, you know, a certain amount of that goes to her, yes, I would agree.
I think, and also, on this one, it's exactly like the decision she made about the energy shift, the Energiewende. There's no going back on this. You can't. You physically can't. And this is Merkel's huge crisis because it's visible. The euro crisis was something not entirely visible for the public, and neither was the crisis actually with Russia over Russia's invasion of eastern Ukraine. It's far away. But we're getting into something very complex here, and the idea for one section of the population, the idea of Europe changing. And they're being open, and these people are confident, and we get another section of the population who feel, no, 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 this is a threat. And for Merkel sees it as an opportunity, and another section sees it as a threat.
Does she see it as an opportunity, Ellen Posner, or does she see it as a necessity? She apparently told the leaders who met last Sunday that if effective measures were not taken, it would spell the end of Europe. Those are strong words from a chancellor who normally isn't given to hype.
Yeah, but she's right.
Yes.
If we can't manage as Europe to manage this crisis, if it's left to Germany, then, and she is forced by the populist wing of her own coalition government and by a certain amount of public opinion to close Germany's borders, and the rest of Europe is putting up borders already. Hungary has done so. Slovenia is talking about it. Even Austria is talking about it. If this, England isn't helping, Britain isn't helping, France, I don't know what would happen if they had to take in numbers like this. Poland's elected a right-wing government. So if this happens, yes, Europe could definitely, or the German vision of Europe could fall apart.
Yeah, and if I can just add one thing, I think it's important to stress that I think Merkel's Wir schaffen das was not just a humanitarian... We can do it. We will manage. Was not just, you know, a humanitarian gesture. I think it was also a political move, because I think she understood right from the beginning that this influx of refugees can't be stopped. She said something, I'm talking in front of the metal union just a week ago. She said, we live in a globalized world. Goods circulate, people circulate. They can't be stopped if they're coming because of, you know, war.
Angela Merkel would definitely answer the title question, no, walls are not the answer. She has said it quite explicitly a number of times. As I say, she said that the crisis could wind up being the end of Europe if it's not managed well. Critics, however, say that some of the new plan's provisions also spell the end of Europe, or at least of its core principles of asylum for the victims of war and political persecution. Let's take a look at two examples.
Example number 1, Afghanistan. Afghan refugees could face repatriation. They would be sent back to a country where Germany is still involved in a military mission. Human rights activists and aid workers say security in Afghanistan is worse than it's been for more than a decade. Police officers and civilians are increasingly being targeted. The Taliban is on the advance, threatening not only women, but everyone claiming their right to an education. Example number 2, Turkey. Critics say Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is responsible for the growing destabilization of the country. They see Turkey on the brink of civil war and dictatorship. Erdogan is not only fighting the Kurds, journalists and opposition activists are being persecuted and imprisoned, and torture is still common practice in Turkish jails.
Janos Stelker, the German Interior Minister, said this week that Germany has given Afghanistan millions in development aid, so it actually ought to be considered safe by now, and people just need to stay there. Isn't that rather cynical at a time when Kunduz, which in fact was the region where much of the German assistance has been focused, when Kunduz has just fallen to the Taliban?
I would say it is. And I would also say it's maybe dangerous to send those people back there. I just talked to an Afghan refugee this week here in Berlin, a young man who's been here for 4 years, and he told me all those people who are being sent back, or not all of them, a majority of those people will get into the hands of the Taliban and ISIL just because the country is in an economic hardship, and these are sort of like the only ways for them to somehow make a living, is joining Taliban or joining ISIL.
And add to that, Judy Dempsey, if you would, a look at Turkey. The police there just this week raided an opposition TV broadcaster. The government is once again going after the Kurds. Can we really say that Turks seeking refuge in Europe absolutely don't deserve it?
I think Turkey is going through an unbelievably dangerous time. And President Erdogan is making everything possible to destroy the remnants of democracy in that country. And the Turkish middle class, or people who believe in democracy and a liberal free press, which was thriving, and the rule of law was really taking shape, going back now would be, frankly, an invitation to be shoved into prison. And we have a real problem with Turkey now. And this is about realpolitik. And Chancellor Merkel has to discover that when she went to visit Erdogan, pleading for help. And as we have to as some European leaders now said, well, promise Turkey this, this and this with the EU. It's going against our own principles.
So, Alan Posner, resolve a paradox, if you would, for us, please, because Angela Merkel has been seen throughout this crisis as the voice of reason and moral principle. Why in the world would she have agreed on Sunday to these two very questionable repatriation principles?
Because they're necessary. We can do it. Doesn't mean to say we can take everyone, absorb everyone, give everyone work, school them, and everything will be fine. We can do it means we can manage this crisis, we can help those who are most in need, and we can only do it, that's sort of the qualification, if we have help. Europe has not helped Angela Merkel. I think
that's
Turkey...
Right.
Right? So then she turns to Turkey. And indeed, Europe is promising Turkey a fast track to membership and other goodies, which will obviously mean turning a blind eye to all sorts of things, whoever is president, by the way, because the other people aren't, you know, angels. The fact remains that someone who seeks asylum doesn't have the right to choose where they get asylum. You may flee from someone who's out to kill you, but you can't then say, well, since I'm fleeing, I think I'd like to go to Germany because the benefits are better there. I can understand that, but it's not a right. So if we say, well, there's parts of Afghanistan at least which we control, you can go there, we have a right to say that. If we say within Turkey, OK, if you're an opposition journalist, you may really have a reason to fear for your life. But if you're just someone who lives in an area which is, I don't know, which is a Kurdish area, you can go somewhere else where there's no, in Turkey, where there's no war, civil war. I mean, let's face it, these people do not need asylum in Germany.
I agree with what you say, but it must be, for public opinion, for the public to continue to support Merkel, the public will go along to give refuge for those who genuinely need it.
Yes.
And that's coming to the point now, and Merkel recognises this. I think she could square the circle, but the message has to get out.
But, Janos Stelker, as Judy Dempsey mentioned a bit earlier, the Chancellor is under considerable pressure within the political elite, including from her own sister party, from the Christian Social Union. Its rather populistically inclined leader has given her an ultimatum, saying that if she doesn't come up with limits on immigration by next Sunday, there's going to be trouble. It's very unclear what trouble exactly, but does that explain her cave-in on this at all?
I think it does, at least partially. I think this push towards deporting more Afghan asylum seekers is really part of a strategy to show strength, to show assertiveness in dealing with this crisis. And for like weeks, this strategy has been targeting so-called economic migrants from the West Balkans. And now it's shifting to Afghans as the numbers of the asylum seekers from the Balkan countries are actually decreasing.
Judy, you shook your head when Janos Stelker said, yes, he thinks it does partly explain it.
And explain her shift. This is... Merkel is alone in this crisis. She's alone at the top. Not only in Germany, although the opposition support her, but alone in Europe. So much for European solidarity. I mean, Merkel brought the Europeans together over sanctions with Russia. Merkel brought the Europeans over saving the Eurozone and other issues. And somehow, and all in the name of solidarity as well, in a strong Europe, and somehow the Europeans are saying, well, Merkel, if you're such a leader, you look after this. So where is solidarity? And, heavens forbid, if something really, really went wrong in Ukraine, would Europe open the door to Ukrainians so welcoming, rather than be so sceptical about allowing so many people from the Arab world in?
Let's take a look at another potential source of pressure that European leaders in many countries are facing. A number of countries are seeing the rise of right-wing parties riding a wave of anxiety and fear about migration. Let's take a look.
There is a move to the right in Europe. The most recent example is Poland. The Nationalist Conservative Law and Justice Party, PIS, stormed to victory on Sunday on an anti-migrant ticket. It opposes taking in Muslim refugees and rejects compulsory refugee quotas. In Switzerland, the right-wing populist SVP also scored a legislative election victory. In its campaign, it called for stricter immigration rules, including quotas on people moving from the EU. And Sweden, known for its liberal asylum policies, saw a racially motivated attack at a school with many immigrant pupils. Observers say it's a sign of a growing radicalization on the right. The far-right Sweden Democrats have soared in opinion polls. Poland, Switzerland, Sweden. Just 3 examples of how right-wing parties are gaining ground in Europe.
Now, Germany, of course, does have its own anti-immigration movement, Alan Posner. You and I talked about it on the show last week. It's Pegida. It's based in Dresden. It also has the alternative for Germany, the AfD party, which had been waning strongly, but is now waxing once again, thanks to the tide of immigration. How much of a threat is that, though, really, to Angela Merkel and to the political elites in the mainstream?
Well, we were talking about Angela Merkel's coalition partner, the CSU, and its populist tones and its idea of possibly going, going national, which I think was the threat behind what Mr. Seehofer said. And I think they're worried, in the right wing of the CDU and the CSU are worried that if the AfD, I mean, they are polling at about 7%, that they could become a strength in politics. And actually, much as I personally dislike the CSU and Mr. Seehofer, its leader, it might be a good idea to have a bona fide right-wing Conservative Party nationally rather than the rather dodgy AfD. So, this is a normal thing. I mean, you have the right-wing Republicans, you have the UKIP, you have the party which is now in power in Poland, you have Front National, so why not have a...
But what you're saying, actually, is that the CDU under Chancellor Merkel has actually fundamentally and radically changed.
Yes.
It's become a modern CDU party, and the party that hasn't changed is the Bavarian-based CSU. And that's the difference. That has remained conservative and rather right-wing and Catholic. And Merkel has actually pushed the CDU over to the centre, made it more modern. So maybe we should need a modern right-wing party.
Yes.
Let the CSU go by themselves then, and let's see if they would survive without Merkel.
Yes.
Very briefly, Janos Stelker, I would like to come back to your opening statement in which you said Europe needs to become better in addressing the reasons that make refugees leave their countries in the first place. You share that opinion with the Chancellor. She has also said we need to address migration at its root causes. But let's be realistic here. Germany is a small country in the middle of Europe. Do you really think it is going to manage to put out the conflagration in the Middle East?
No, Germany by itself isn't. Europe as a whole is a whole, different question already, and I agree with what's been said earlier. There needs to be more European solidarity in dealing with this crisis and in dealing with the root causes. In just very practical terms, I think there need to be more money for at those places where migration pressure is emerging. That's the important part.
But Alan Posner, we don't have that cooperation. What we seem to have is a kind of a prisoner's dilemma. Everybody would be better off if they cooperate, but if one builds walls, then the others feel like they have to go along. Is that where we're heading?
That's a possibility. I'm waiting for the next US president. Maybe he will really do something decisive on Syria and Europeans will go along.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us this week, and see you next week.